Hello. Welcome back, everyone, to the final session of the day. I hope you're all feeling really pumped up and inspired. For our last session, we have a very special conversation. Starting out, we're working with Andreessen Horowitz, which has been a long-time partner and sponsor of the Lean Startup Conference. And every year, they send dozens of members from their portfolio companies to come and learn with us. So this year, we're really thrilled to have Chris Dixon, who's a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, to the stage for a conversation with Eric. So a little bit about Chris. He was the co-founder and CEO of two startups, SiteAdvisor and Hunch. As an investor, Chris co-founded Founder Collective, a seed venture fund, and he made early-stage investments in some companies you may have heard of like BuzzFeed, Uber, and MakerBot, and among others. He's also been an active angel investor, making personal investments in technology companies, including Foursquare, Kickstarter, Stripe, Warby Parker, Pinterest, and others. He's also a prolific writer, and he blogs over at medium.com. So welcome, Eric and Chris. All right.
How's it going?
Good.
Welcome.
Nice crowd.
Whoa, hi everybody. They came back.
So to put some context in these questions a little bit, Chris, you placed some bold bets with what some people call fringe technologies, such as virtual reality, like Oculus, which was acquired by Facebook, and drones, Airware and Skydio, and food, such as Soylent. And Eric, you've worked with and invested in companies to help them build new products. And of course, the Lean Startup has been a springboard for many startups. So with that context in mind, what do you two think are the technology trends that you're most excited about right now?
I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so we invest in all sorts of things, anything that has sort of software at its core. And so we do a lot of stuff around we think a lot of interesting changes are happening now in the data center, so things around storage and networking and things like that. And so, big data, you might hear about this, machine learning. That's sort of a whole practice we have. We do a lot of consumer investing. We're investors in things like Pinterest and Airbnb. And then we do a lot, I've personally spent a lot of time on kind of more what we kind of call outlier, sort of futuristic kind of stuff, which is like Oculus and virtual reality and some stuff around food tech. We've been doing some more in kind of healthcare, the intersection of healthcare and software. What else? Drones, like a lot of hardware things where, what's happened is because of the proliferation of smartphones, a lot of it's become much cheaper to build very high quality hardware products. So all these things, everything from like drop cam to Nest to drones to VR, or all these things are kind of reconfigured cell phones, and there's a lot of creativity around that. I don't know, there's a whole long list of things, but basically, we think it's a really interesting time where you have the intersection of sort of, there's 2.5 billion people now with smartphones, with internet-connected smartphones, and there's a lot of changes going on in the way businesses use software, in terms of like switching from what's called on-premise to cloud software, kind of SaaS, things like that. And we just think there's sort of a confluence of a bunch of different things, kind of trends coming together that make it a really interesting time for entrepreneurs and for venture capitalists.
I think it's interesting you see those trends like throughout the presentations we've had today, and especially in a number of the breakouts where, we don't build Lean Startup Conference as a software conference. A lot of people here from the software industry, but a lot of people who are not in the software industry. And whenever I travel around the world, every once in a while I meet somebody and they're kind of like, is mobile here to stay? I'm like, uh-oh, yeah, is the internet going to be a fad, or is it going to be for real, or, the real question is like, is software going to eat my business if it hasn't yet? And, the kind of the semiconductor revolution and the kind of the underlying logic that has driven a lot of that technological change is what creates the opportunities for disruption that require things like lean startup methods to cope with. So I think, every once in a while it's useful to kind of pan the camera lens back a little bit and say, like, why now? Why are we having this conversation? Why are these new methods necessary? Why is the pace of change happening? And I think you'll see, software is got its fingerprints all over that story.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think another way to kind of think about what's happening right now in the world that we believe is that you kind of originally, Silicon Valley was all about creating kind of better computers, so going back to the mainframe and then the PC and the mobile phone. And we think now increasingly it's about kind of taking these inventions and applying them to other industries that traditionally were not kind of thought of as tech industries. So I mentioned healthcare before. I think also finance. We're seeing a lot of very interesting things going on in finance, sort of fintech. Education is another big one. If you just kind of go through, just kind of the U.S. GDP or the global GDP, and you look at the really, really big categories of where kind of money is spent, it's the vast majority of it is categories like I just mentioned, like healthcare, finance, transportation, technology, food. I think what we're seeing now is sort of tech is no longer staying in its corner and doing what it was sort of originally doing, and it's spreading out. Obvious examples like Uber and Lyft and all the on-demand companies, where just who would have predicted 10 years ago that the taxi industry would be one of the industries that would go through tremendous change due to mobile. It just I don't think it was on anyone's really radar as an obvious prediction, and we think the same thing. We'll be saying the same things in 10 years about 5 to 10 other industries that no one really expected to dramatically change.
So within those industries, how do you choose which companies are going to be good investments?
So we do multi-stage investing. So we invest from seed stage to what's called Series A, Series B, and then some occasionally sort of later stage growth investments. So it really kind of varies depending on the stage. At the seed stage, it's often the kind of characteristic thing will be it'll be often very technical entrepreneurs. Sometimes they come out of, let's say, a university with a breakthrough kind of new software technology, and that would be something we'd invest in an early stage. Other things like consumer apps, social network type thing, messaging, those types of things we might invest, based on sort of metrics and growth and things like that. So it kind of varies by stage. I think for us at the core, we look for people that have some kind of special expertise that they bring to what they do. It could be technical expertise if they're doing something very technical. So in that case, it's whatever, they have a PhD or something and they spent years working on something. It could be domain expertise. So somebody who came from, I came out of the fashion industry or came from Wall Street or whatever it might be, and while I was there, I noticed all these things that weren't working the way I thought they should be working. And now I have a solution to those problems. So people with deep domain expertise. In some cases, it's also people that come from kind of what I would call kind of like cultural expertise, sort of, people that maybe are part of a movement, like something like Airbnb or something, which is sort of, more of kind of like a cultural movement that just, that maybe not, when it started off wasn't obvious to everyone, but might have been obvious to the founders. So we look for something kind of like that, like people that have some sort of real deep kind of connection to what they're working on. We call this concept founder market fit, and it's sort of it's the close cousin to product market fit. It's the thing prior to it.
Right.
So sort of we look for founder market fit and then later on product market fit.
So I'm really curious. We got a lot of folks in the room here who have a startup or are at some stage. Like, how do they know it's time to send the business plan to Andreessen Horowitz?
How do they
know they're ready?
Whenever you're ready. We have all the contact information on our website A16Z. So feel free to. It really will vary depending on the type of thing, but. We tend at the earlier stage to kind of lean towards more technical things, but we invest in all sorts of things. Soylent is an example of a food company but it has a lot of software and technology involved. But we have a pretty wide range. There has to be something kind of software related for us, so just because of what we know.
All right.
So speaking of founders, what do you both think is different about starting a company today than when you were both starting companies?
Oh my God, it's been a sea change. I mean, I did my first startup during the dot-com bubble, and the amount of information available online about startups was, close to none, and a lot of the information that was available was terrible. And I remember, I was trying to get advice about what it meant to be in a startup and what do I do, and it's I look back on it now, and a lot of the advice was just gibberish. It was all over the map. There was no Y Combinator to apply to. There was no lean startup. There were no books to read about it. Forget lean startup. There wasn't even the hard things about the hard things. Like there was all these books and information that exists now about like what does the inside experience look like, what does success as an entrepreneur look like, How do you know you have a good business plan? I mean, just like go down the list of things that we absolutely take for granted. And then the other thing that was really different was just the cost of getting started was dramatically different. So I mean, I was right on the cusp. I actually had the debate with my co-founders about whether we had to pay for an Oracle license or whether it would be okay to use MySQL. And we actually investigated both possibilities, and we discovered that like no matter how much money we spent, we couldn't figure out how to install Oracle. So I was like, well, okay, well, let's not do that. At least MySQL we know how to. I mean, so it was still a question in those days, and there was no AWS or anything like that. But at least it was like we could kind of talk ourselves into using open source software to get started, and that kind of ability to start small, but then stay on the same platform as you scale, the kind of continuous path to scale, I think is the most remarkable thing about the infrastructure that we take for granted today. Not just AWS, but in customer acquisition channels like AdWords and all that stuff. Like I remember the first time I heard about Google AdWords, and I went to put in my credit card. And AdWords wasn't the first I'd heard about. First I heard about Yahoo's Overture, probably before Yahoo acquired it. I was like, oh, I'll go to Overture, set up. And there was a $50 minimum to open your account. And I was like, oh, that's too expensive. Can't afford that, never mind. And then I tried Google AdWords next. There was no minimum. You could start spending even 5 cents. And I was like, okay, no minimum, that sounds good to me. And that ultimately, Google made like, an extra $50 million that Yahoo didn't make because of that difference. But the power of being able to start with no minimum or a few dollars in your account and use that same platform till you're spending like millions of dollars a year in customer acquisition, that kind of start small but then scale up fast, I think is also really incredible.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, not only is it orders of magnitude cheaper to start particularly like a software company, really it really was tens of millions of dollars in the 90s to set up. You had to go set up your own data center, and it was like that was sort of the minimum to get going, and now it's really just it's $10,000 or something to run for your first instance or something. So you have to hire developers. A lot of times you'll see these startups where there's just the founders or the developers, and so there's just literally almost no cost. But then the other part of that is the size of the market, which is now there are 3 billion people. I think our Benedict Evans, who works with us, has does these projections. I think he believes it'll be basically 80% of adults on Earth in 2020 will have internet-connected smartphones, and it's hard to the other thing to realize. I think PCs were something on the scale of. I mean, it's significant. Like it's more than half of those people never had internet PCs. So this is the first time they've had access to the internet was through a smartphone. And that will be the case for the vast majority of people. So, so there's now, you can create an app now, and you can reach soon 4 billion people. If you go back to the 90s, I think the Netscape at the peak, or Amazon and the other companies, maybe they're getting up to 100 million. But the other dimension there was it was 100 million people. But if people that were around the 90s remember, you weren't sitting on your phone all day. You were like on AOL, like dial up, and then it'd kick you off, and it was like you're there for 15 minutes, and then it was like the amount of time spent was a tenth. So now you have 30 to 50 times as many people with internet access spending at least 10, maybe 100 times as much time on it. So the amount of sort of minutes you can access, and then just like the infrastructure around payments and the people's willingness to spend money online. It sounds almost comical today, but if you talk to Mark Andreessen and the Netscape folks, like they spent years trying to get encryption standards because no one ever thought people would actually pay on the internet. So they had to actually go and build all that encryption, and they built JavaScript and all these things we take for cookies and these things we take for granted all came out of Netscape, and they had to build all this stuff because it wasn't there. And so now we have all of this infrastructure, people paying money, people spending all this time. It's literally like sort of, it costs probably 100th as much to start a company, and you can reach 1,000 times as many, kind of people minutes or whatever, however you want to measure it, right?
Exactly.
Like it's just, so the scale you can reach and is amazing. And it just sort of creates all sorts of really interesting opportunities.
Totally. I remember at multiple points in the last 15 years feeling like I was too late to the party. Like in 1999, I felt that way. I was like, all the good ideas had already been invented, and I was born at the wrong time, and I missed the chance to build a big company, and I felt that way in 2004 and 2000. I feel like every 5 years I've been like, I missed the window. So I think there's something that. It's all. It's like, I should have been the one to create whatever.
They were going to shut down the patent office or something.
It's too late, and it's like there's something about the pace of change I think that is so counterintuitive to feel like you look at all the things that have been created and how all the incredible wealth has been created and the incredible opportunity for customers, and then to also somehow hold in your head that this is the very, very, very beginning and there's still like 100 times more, 1,000 times more, who knows, to be done, means you kind of can't be too late when you're going through that kind of transition.
So you both talked a lot about the opportunities in front of people, but what are some of the common mistakes that you see a lot of entrepreneurs making these days?
That's a great question. Let me see. I think there's all sorts of, it's a long list. It's very, startups are hard, and there's a lot of ways, there's sort of a million different ways to mess things up. I think right now what we're seeing is because sort of money is flowing relatively, relatively easily. People are raising money, so we're just seeing a lot of people, I think, who probably raise too much money and for things that maybe shouldn't be venture backed. There's a lot of, I believe that there's only a very small percentage of startups in the world should actually raise venture capital. We are a very specific thing that we do, which is we invest in companies that can potentially reach those 3 billion people in the case of a consumer, or in the case of businesses, reach the top 10,000 companies or something. So it's a very specific type of capital that's for a specific type of company, and there's lots of phenomenal businesses in the world that don't raise venture capital and don't need to and shouldn't. And so I think that's one thing that happens in kind of these in times. We're getting a lot. The startup world is getting a lot of media coverage and other things, and the Social Network movie and all these things have made it kind of, I don't know, more glamorous and maybe more people want to raise venture capital. When I think actually it's a relatively it's a relatively small industry, and it's a relatively narrow type of capital, and there's plenty of other types of capital. I'd say that's one mistake. I don't know. I don't know. I feel like sometimes hype is our chief export from Silicon Valley. Just the conversation gets so out of, so unhinged from the reality. But one thing I think that is important for a lot of us to think about, and this is something I'm curious, get your take on too, is too much money for a startup can kind of be just as lethal as not enough money. And so many of us who have trouble raising money, or that scrappy trying to get started with a startup, it's so hard to believe that there could be such a thing as too much money. But I see it all the time, that the frugality and the limitations of being kind of at the right stage of funding for your idea can drive a lot of creativity and innovation that you kind of don't get if you have too much money, too big of an opportunity kind of in front of you. You guys must. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's. I mean, it sounds like a easy, great problem to have, and it is a great problem to have too much money. But it's just the reality is somehow, that just the sort of one of these, it's almost like a law of physics or something, where somehow the money gets spent within 18 months, no matter how much money is raised, and it's because it's this very natural tendency, when you are working on problems, and some great person will come to you and you're like, wow, I should pursue that other interesting project, or hey, we're having a problem over here. Well, the natural thing to do is to increase the budget and hire some people to go solve that. So it's a very natural sort of thing to have happen. And then of course it's just very competitive. If you're based here in San Francisco, the rents are incredibly expensive, which of course means salaries have to be incredibly expensive to afford the rents, and the whole thing is just it's just a very so I would say that's definitely one of the mistakes we see.
What about this idea of being an entrepreneur? Is this something that's now becoming an acceptable career path for people, and there's a lot more resources for people that want to go down this path?
Certainly, I think for good and for ill. I think on the one hand, the cool thing is, I really think for the first time in history, entrepreneurship is kind of a viable career path. As a stable career that you could have, not just in Silicon Valley, but in a lot of places. You could be like, I'm going to do entrepreneurial type things for my whole career, and I'm going to keep working at startups until I find one that hits. I'm going to both be a founder myself and work at early stage companies and develop an expertise around that. And that's because there's so much startup activity happening now, that's a real possibility. And because frankly the system has become a lot more democratized, than the economic systems of the past were. Not to say that we don't have a long way to go, but certainly relatively speaking. On the flip side, we see this in the boom and bust cycle of startups all the time. When entrepreneurship becomes sexy and cool thing to do, look out. Because I think that a lot of people get drawn into the ecosystem, not necessarily for especially good motives, and for whom it's not actually a very good fit. And I've worked with some people over the years where I'm just like, you have so many amazing talents that would be better applied elsewhere. So don't do a startup. Like the stress that you're experiencing and the kind of freak out that it's causing for you. Like there's other choices that would be more appropriate. So I think when you start to see that happening too much, that's a danger sign.
Yeah, I mean, one way to look at it is, what's great about entrepreneurs is entrepreneurs are building things. And one way to sort of think about like sort of the broader economy, like the U.S. economy, is think of it as like a company where you have a finance department and an accounting department and an R&D department. And if you go back and you look at the last decade, I think in like 2007, like sort of at the real estate kind of financial peak, if you look at like the S&P, like it was something in the order of 40% of profits of American companies came from the financial sector. In my mind, that's something is off when and if you look at the actual amount of money, like in my industry in venture capital, people say it's sort of a bubble. It's like it's on the order of tens of billions of dollars invested in the entire industry per year. Yeah, it's actually a very, very small industry. It's like it's a fraction of the amount of investment in areas like finance and healthcare. It's a fraction. So on the one hand, I agree with you that like there's some danger of hype and froth. On the other hand, I think it's very healthy as a society that we have now. If you're a smart kid coming out of school, like you're not just thinking about going to McKinsey and Goldman Sachs,
Amen.
And, which is the consulting department of the company, the finance department, the accounting department. Like you're now thinking about going to the R&D department. And that's a great thing, right? I think that's a great thing that we have more people who want to build stuff. And I think it's important for society. I think it's important for the country to be competitive because it's certainly also happening in China and other places. If we want to be competitive, we have to build great things, and that's what. I think there's two movements. There's the startup movement, but there's also this kind of movement towards, I think, building things, which is I think is a very positive movement, and I hope there's a long-term trend.
So kind of building on that idea, we have this changing world of business where we have traditional management that doesn't work in the same way, and then we have people in startups who are used to things like co-working and digital nomads. So with that in mind, how should startups really think about approaching developing their staff and putting their companies together as far as their hiring, their marketing, their scaling, and how they approach growth?
That's a big topic. I mean, I'm actually really curious about, so first of all, there's nothing more important than hiring. There's nothing more important than the caliber of the people that you bring into your company, and that nothing in lean startup changes that basic fact. I'm curious, especially as as things are super competitive and companies are really struggling to figure out how you're going to get the bodies to scale, and how do you find the right enough smart people to do it. Like, I'm curious what you guys are advising your portfolio companies. Like, how do you think about building a hiring plan and how to think about that?
So I don't know anything about making movies, but you watch the end of the movie. So my naive view about Hollywood is that there's stars, there's whatever, Brad Pitt or something, and then there's directors like Martin Scorsese or something, and then there's all these things you see that scroll by at the end. If you actually go talk to the key grip and the gaffer, or I don't know what and you go talk to people in Hollywood, it turns out these people, like, the reason that movies now look really good compared to movies 20 years ago is all those other people, right? And I think it's similar with startups, which is this whole kind of giant infrastructure, much of it which exists in this, in San Francisco and in the Peninsula, which is all these very, very important people, which is things like, somebody who's sold software to, who sold data center software to Fortune 1000 companies, or what, there's a whole long list of things. And we tend to, I think, glamorize sort of the venture capitalists or the investors and the entrepreneurs and maybe engineers, but there's this whole other cast of characters who are extremely important. And so what we advise people is to kind of respect those skills and respect all of the expertise that's there, and hire people with experience for a lot of those roles, and not try to kind of figure it out, because a lot of these things, they're real. It's like, any field, when you dig into it, there's a lot of technical and creative and craftsmanship and all these other kinds of things that go into it. And so that's a lot of it. So what we try to do is kind of find really interesting entrepreneurs who maybe are technical or have some domain expertise, and then sort of help them find kind of all these the gaffer and key grips of the world, and sort of help them put together the kind of whole thing.
Yeah, I certainly wish that more of that cast of characters got credit when there's a successful startup, but it wasn't so. I think we find this, it's very human to want to shine the spotlight on the founder and the famous people who were involved. But I think there's a huge, every success, there's this massive cast of characters that deserve the credit too. one of the things I think about hiring and thinking about the trap that people fall into, where they build, an awesome tops-down business plan based on, industry trends and whatever, and then that convert that into a hiring plan. And they're like, well, I have this huge market opportunity, and therefore I have to hire a ton of people. And then that, if the business plan doesn't come true, people wind up into trouble. I know you guys have, been public about some of the advice that you give people in terms of thinking about their business plan in a different way. I just thought maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Sorry, so you're thinking about what about a business plan?
Yeah, just like how do you make a good business plan? How do you avoid the kind of common trap of convincing yourself that there's a market there that actually is not?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that it used to be that the best practice was to write like a 30-page business plan, and then the trends kind of swung, the pendulum swung the other way. And we'll often meet entrepreneurs who don't even have like a pitch deck or something. I personally, you may not, the reality is that most investors won't read a 30-page business. They want to talk to you and things. There's other, they'll want to read a PowerPoint and then talk to you. That's just mostly how it works. But I think it's a very useful exercise to do. I highly recommend it. I did it for my first company, and and basically went through and kind of thought of it as here's a 20-page essay arguing as to why this should exist, and then come up with all the counter arguments and work your way through it. And of course, it's not going to be right. It's I think it was Eisenhower who said no. Plans are overrated, but planning is indispensable, or something. So it's the act of going through the planning that's very useful. Once you actually go out and do it, it ends up being all changed. But the fact that you spend so much time thinking about it is really important. One analogy we like to use is to think about a startup as kind of a maze. We call it the idea maze, and the maze is sort of like you're traversing through this maze, and you're figuring out, okay, should I, it's 2005, and I'm creating a video site that anyone can upload their video to on YouTube, and then meanwhile YouTube had a competitor that paid the creators, and someone else used Flash, and someone else used this technology, and there's all these trade-offs you make. You choose this tech, you choose this business plan, you choose these people. Why did you make this choice? And then it turns out the choices you make, that you almost always are wrong about them. And then you have to change, and whether you call it a pivot or even a turn in the, I don't know, what's the difference exactly? Something, it's a matter of degree, but it always ends up being that you adapt and change. And so I think to the extent you can't really game this out fully ahead of time, but to the extent you can, look, if you're going to do at least a venture-backed startup, it's at least a 5-year, probably a 10-year, 5 to 10-year commitment. Think of it as. It's a long time. I would say one is do something you really care about, because it's going to be difficult, and that's going to keep you going, is the fact that you actually think it's important. And then two, to the extent you can front load the planning and de-risk anything you can de-risk at all, and just think it through and whatever, I think it's a great exercise. I think it's fallen a little bit out of favor, and I think it's somewhat unfortunate, but
Yeah, I feel like I'm the last pro-business plan person left in startup land among the various talking heads, because the fiction writing part of the business plan we can discard. Okay, so it's fine to do the exercise, write the essay, but nobody reads those, and it's a personal journey of creativity and understanding. So you don't need to share it with anybody else. You can just keep it in the drawer with your poems and other creative output. But the spreadsheet that you build in the back of the spreadsheet, in the back of the business plan, where you actually try to show how individual customer behaviors mathematically add up to a business that makes sense, and show the projections of that over time. Even though the outputs of that spreadsheet are very likely to be wrong, the inputs, the drivers, those are those leap of faith assumptions that then become really good targets for MVPs and experimentation and the really day-to-day activities of an early stage company. So leave the fiction writing behind, but keep the spreadsheet.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there's and I think this is a lot of stuff you talk about, in your books and things, is that and there's certain methodologies that are really helpful, I think, here. For example, doing what we call bottom-up versus top-down market sizing, which means actual nose counting of who I'm going to sell this. I'm making software I'm going to sell to banks. Who are the actual banks that are going to buy it? Who are the people that are going to buy it? As opposed to the opposite, which is I'm going to get 1% of the world, and it's going to be awesome, right? Which is just it's just not a good way to do it. That's sort of what we call top-down. There's this many people that fit in this demographic. Think of it the other way, which is who am I actually going to get? What's my plan? And then to Eric's point, your financial projections are always going to be wrong, but things like your unit economics, how for every dollar of revenue you generate, how that gets spent, that might actually be kind of ballpark correct, and is something that you can really kind of analyze ahead of time. And so there's a lot of really valuable things you can do, even though in the end it'll probably be mostly wrong.
Yeah, I think one powerful thing about having that framework in place is that when you learn something surprising, about how customers actually behave or competitors or anything else about the market, you have a model that you can plug that new learning into to understand its impact on the total business. So like when your unit economics, you realize, whoops, my costs are 10 times higher than I thought. What does that mean in terms of my business? Am I doomed or not? Or the amount customers will pay is 10 times higher than I thought, or the customer retention is 4 times better than I thought, or worse. Whatever it is, you have a kind of tool for understanding the trade-offs of the different choices that you're making. And I think that tool is helpful for sharpening our thinking.
All right, I think at this point we're going to open this up to questions. So we have someone with a mic. Raise your hand if you have a question. I know you guys have questions. Okay.
Cool. It's a simple question, but it's a hard question, and you can answer it the way you want. How do you think, as an investor, you have to think about the future? How do you think about the future? What are sort of your mental frameworks, your mental models?
It's a great question. I mean, it's obviously like I just wrote a blog post where I started off by saying, if 10 years ago someone had told you that one of the top 10 market cap companies in the world would be a social network, that the biggest knowledge repository in the world would be a crowdsourced encyclopedia, and that 3 billion people would have internet-connected Linux or Unix supercomputers in their pockets, like it would have seemed ridiculous just 10 years ago. And it's all true. So the answer is we don't know. Like nobody knows. Anyone who claims to know, it doesn't. And we don't know also what's going to happen to the economy. I think when people ask people like us, like, hey, is the fundraising market going to be good next year? Like, look, macroeconomists don't know. No one's ever predicted this correctly. There are hedge funds who all spend all their time, studying these things, and they don't really have a very good track record. Like the old joke is economists have predicted 9 of the last 3 recessions or something. So the answer is I don't know. Now, that said, I think there are leading indicators for the future. And so, for example, one thing I like to look at is, I have this blog post I wrote, it's like what the smartest people do on the weekends is what everyone else will do at work in 10 years. And it's sort of a little bit provocative, but the point is really that you think about like why did so many tech startups begin as hobbies? And I think there's a real deep reason for that, which is those people were voting kind of with they were smart people who kind of voted with their time. Like there's sort of 2 ways to vote on things, right? One is with money, and the business people get money to give out, and people like investors, right? And the other way to vote is with your time. And it turns out smart people voting with their time has been a better predictor in many cases than business tech people voting with their time than business people with their money. And that's and it's also partly a time horizon thing. People that do things on the weekends, you're messing around with PCs in 1977. It's because you're thinking about the long term. You're not thinking about like a 2-year return, right? So that's always been a great indicator. I think a lot of things in our business will often start off being kind of dismissed as toys. So Twitter, oh, it's just for having lunch. Why is it just for having lunch? It's not really, oh, Skype, it's just a chat app. But then what happens is, this is kind of stuff that like Clay Christensen talks about if you read his books, is that these technologies get better and better and kind of sneak up on people. And another thing I think is a really good indicator is just there's always like certain like hotbeds of experimentation going on. Where like the internet in the 90s, whatever, where people are just like running lots of experiments and people are doing interesting stuff, and a lot of it doesn't work, and it does, and just like there's sort of like areas of creativity. If you go back, it's really interesting. Like I like reading these books about the kind of history of technology where it turns out like University of Utah in the 70s, had you gone there, you probably would have been the best venture capitalist, so like one of the best venture capitalists in the world if you just went to University of Utah in the 70s, invested in every computer graphics company. It was Adobe and Pixar, and like literally everyone was there. Because someone at University of Utah decided to give, I think there was a grant given, and someone from Berkeley, I think, moved over, and they gave a grant, and decided they were going to do computer graphics when no one else was doing computer graphics, right? And so it's sort of this scene, and if you look at like, I'm told in movies it was like New York in the 60s, and in comedy it was Chicago in the 70s. I don't know those industries, I might be wrong, but like there's always sort of these interesting movements going on too, and probably at some point, in 2025, they'll be, wow, 2015, man, it was X, Y, and Z, those places, all that interesting stuff came out of it, and part of our job is to figure out where that is. I don't know the answer. I mean, we make bets on it, and we try to make predictions, but we're hopefully right some of the time, but it's very hard to predict.
I think what's striking about that is how often the place where the thing emerges is not Silicon Valley necessarily. Yeah. It's just people in Silicon Valley are attuned, have a radar for that, and kind of keep their eyes open for that when it happens. So it's not, I think probably a lot of people here who are not local, who are not here from Silicon Valley, one of the questions I would have for you is when you go home, what's like distinctively interesting that people are excited about there that maybe, we haven't heard about yet, and that could be an interesting place to look for an idea.
All right, next question.
You talked about hiring people being one of the most important things of running a startup. At the same time, we, of course, all have budget restrictions, restraints. How would you see the best way to balance between hiring really good people for a lot of money and hiring people that are maybe a little bit less good but do get the work done? How do you do this?
I love the assumption baked into your question that the skill that someone brings is correlated to how much they get paid. If only that was true in our world. I know. You deal with that question more often than I do. What advice do you give your?
Well, I think this is one area where we find is that it's sort of that actually sort of hard problems end up being easier. And I think Sam Altman from Y Combinator said that. Someone said that. I'm taking their line, but the answer is when you do something really hard, like I'm going to go cure cancer, or I'm going to whatever make like self-driving cars. What happens is it turns out that a lot of really smart people want to work on those important problems. And those are kind of what we would call kind of mission-driven companies. And those, it sounds sort of, it's not just sort of altruistic or something that we want to invest in mission-driven companies. It turns out they can just recruit a lot better people. And I think that's a really important thing. And it's a good filter, frankly, that you want people that will work for equity and that believe in the mission of the company and will work for, they probably will work for like a lower cash compensation. That's just generally like a good sign as well. But I think a lot of it is like to really have like something that you're selling that's more than a salary. That's like a real mission that people want to be part of.
I've always viewed that as a warning sign. If you're having trouble recruiting people and salary as a sticking point, the way to interpret that is that people's total compensation, there's a lot of good academic research on this, like people's total compensation, all the psychic value they get from working at a certain company, the amount of cash money they take home at the end of the day is a relatively small component in terms of their motivation. Their satisfaction in terms of the quality of the work they get to do, who they get to work with and who their coworkers are, the sense of autonomy. There's a lot of other attributes, but the mission of the organization and the kind of caliber of people that you get to work with is such a critical component. If you can't make the sale on that basis, then something's wrong with the pitch, or maybe it's just not a good fit of a person. So I would actually take that as a serious signal from the market that maybe do a little bit deep thinking about, are you actually working on a problem that's important enough to you that you could make it a compelling pitch for why someone should, spend their life working on it.
Your next question.
While startups are becoming lean, investors and the way investors interact with startups is still. A few minutes ago, we were talking about business plans and things like that. I mean, in the age of lean canvas, where you could probably not have to go through the pain of reading 30 pages by reading just an A4 size sheet, isn't there a change that is happening in terms of the frequency at which the interaction between a startup and the investor takes place, the review process, and also the change of business models and the frequency at which investor steps in to advise and makes a decision to withdraw from the startup and or to take it to the next level. So is it still the quarterly model or the monthly model, or how is it working now?
Have you noticed that kind of the more rapid iterative style of development kind of gives you more looks as an investor, more sense of whether the company's making progress faster maybe than it would have in the past?
Sorry, I don't fully understand. Was it startups are making more progress because of the interaction?
I think it's more like, does the fact that there's more experiments happening, that there's more iteration happening, does that give you more insight as an investor as to whether it's a place to double down or withdraw?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, so I don't have a lot to compare it to. I've done this for 7 or 8 years, and so it's been I think the big change that's happened, frankly, is at least in my world, in our area of sort of activity and investing, is that the founders are much more in charge and have a much more kind of like in almost all the cases, like we don't have kind of a controlling interest of the company, and so we're involved, but we're advisors to the company, and I think that's been a bit, pretty big change since from sort of the prior kind of era, the beginning of venture capital. I don't know how. Sorry, I don't have a good answer to the lean startup part, but
Yeah, it's. I think it's a mistake to over-focus on the investor side of the equation, to be honest. I think, of course, it's helpful to understand investors. It's important, especially if you want to be raising money from venture capital. Of course, understanding how they think is very valuable. But honestly, I think what's really important is to have somebody in your life who can be an accountability partner for what you're doing. Because as an entrepreneur, the number one thing we see, and there's like really good psychology research for this, like the longer you work on your own thing, the better an idea it sounds to you. It's an inevitable part of being human. It's so easy to get into your own bubble and to become convinced that you're on the right track, you're doing the right thing, and to have somebody who you trust, you have a relationship with. They're not your boss. You don't work for them. They don't tell you what to do, but they're a partner who you can bounce ideas off of. You show them progress on a regular basis, and you kind of go on a journey with them, and they can kind of call you on your BS to say, listen, you've been giving me the same update 3 meetings in a row. Have you actually learned something of value here? Do you actually know what you're doing? Like, are these experiments actually valuable? And even though it can sometimes feel adversarial, if you have a board and you have external people you're accountable to, or I'm sure even if you're like a garage entrepreneur and you're spending your life savings and your spouse has some pointy questions for you, it can kind of be the same. But somebody who's there to kind of ask you the tough questions and make sure that you use that as a reality check to make sure you're not deluding yourself about the progress your startup is making.
Next question's over there.
Hi, what do you think about the company adopting an organizational structure like a holacracy where, there's not such a thing as like top-down and they give employees more power, tensions are relieved quicker? Do you think that's the kind of organizational structure that would benefit most companies?
You on the board of any holacracy companies?
I think, I guess, no, I don't. I mean, I do think there's a tendency of a lot of, especially like kind of engineer founders it's appealing to sort of think about new organizational structures and to try to make things kind of more, equal and things. The problem I think often is it's sort of fake holacracy, right? Because if it's really holacracy, like, I don't know. I mean, like, is it truly the case that people are equal, or in the end, is it really just sort of you're just obfuscating the titles and you really have a structure? So I guess if you're going to go all the way with it, I've never seen someone really go all the way with it. I've seen a lot of cases where people kind of like dabble in it, and I think that's kind of neither here nor there. I don't know. I think I think for a lot of, companies seem to work pretty well with I think kind of a centralized structure and having a centralized kind of decision-making process. There are these sort of alleged counterexamples of companies that have holacracies, but then when you actually, in my experience, when you actually talk to people that work there, it wasn't the case. So I don't know if it really works. I'm kind of skeptical, to be honest. I think that there's a million things to innovate on in a startup, but they should be like product and tech and other things, and that there's other things that are sort of time-tested, things like use standard law firms and and like at least at the beginning, use sort of a standard organizational structure. And then maybe if you're it's like painting or something, like don't jump right from zero to, Picasso or something, right? You got to go through like the realism stage or something. So it's the same kind of thing. Like maybe if you're super advanced and you've done this for years and you've gone through every iteration of the traditional structure, you can try something like that. But for your first company, I personally recommend spending your time innovating on the product and the technology and not on things like organizational structure. But
we got a question about holacracy. I think it was last year when we had Bob Sutton here, who's at the School of Engineering at Stanford and studies management structures, and he told me my favorite joke about holacracy. He said, well, I can tell you for sure that even in the most pure holacracy, there's at least 2 levels. There's the guy who said, let's be a holacracy, and everybody else. And I thought that's so right on. And actually, and I had the same kind of an engineering view that layers and management is kind of all BS and not valuable. And I used to think that in order to have decentralized decision making, we had to have decentralized structure. And I don't know, I haven't worked with any pure holacracies either, so I can't speak about holacracies specifically, but I've been very surprised. And if you look at some of the examples of companies that have presented just today, there are some very hierarchical, very top-down, very rigid, very disciplined companies that have been able to adopt Lean Startup and really build a decentralized system, because having really clear accountability and having a really clear org chart and being able to say from the top down, this is how things are going to be around here, that allows you to implement a rule like, we're going to push decision-making about product down to the lowest level. You can adopt a rule that says, hey, we're going to have internal startups and give them a lot of freedom. teams that are a little bit looser in structure and there's not so much clarity, it's actually quite hard to establish a rule like that because there's all kinds of meddling and inconsistency as you go down the layers of the organization. So I think a lot of the question about corporate structure, we have to say not is structure good or bad, but to what purpose is the structure being used? Is it being used for good ends, for decentralized ends, for innovative ends, or is it being used for control and stifling and standardization and the elimination of the rough edges?
We have the last question here.
Hi, my name is Marlon. Come from the nonprofit sector, and a quick question. So there's often a lot of groans about the way funders are investing in nonprofit organizations, hoping for solving the problem really fast, and unwilling to fund a lot of the overhead expenses, keeping the lights on, et cetera. What would be if you could say something to the foundation world about how you invest, your strategies for investing, or if you could maybe share some insights as to the organizations that you fund that are cause-based, what would that be?
I guess me. So I think that there's a lot of great, obviously a lot of the great sort of projects that out there are nonprofit. There's also, I think, a lot of for-profit companies that do a lot of good things. So for example, I'm a personal investor in Kickstarter, which recently became a public benefit corp, which I think is a really interesting new structure, which is it's kind of complicated because there's like a B Corp, which is a organization.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
And there's public benefit corp, I think I'm getting it right, which is a legal category in like 35 states or something like that, which is a really interesting movement, which is basically to have a new corporate structure where you still generate revenue from customers. So the Kickstarter's case, they take 5% of the fund's pledge. That's their business model. But they have made this, they've legally committed to having a duty to not only to their shareholders, the way that a traditional C Corp would, but also to their community, to their employees, and to the society at large. And I think it's a really interesting structure because it's a different way to fund it. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of very valuable things done in the nonprofit sector, and I support a bunch of nonprofits, and I'm very excited about that. I also think I think there's this really interesting new kind of middle ground because it lets you kind of, I think, potentially, in theory, like for example, I'll give you an example. Like one challenge in a nonprofit is like as with all companies, is recruiting. But if you can, in a company, if you can have a public benefit corp, you can kind of mix some of the financial incentives of having a stock option in like a tech company with the social mission, right? So I think there's some interesting experiments going on, like what Kickstarter did, and I think you'll see more of that. I hope we're very supportive of it. I think it's great, and would like to see more experiments around that.
I'll just say one thing about the foundation world. First of all, we should clarify that we're talking about intentional, not-for-profit companies.
Yeah, we got a
lot of the unintentional kind too, and that's a funny joke, but it's also actually very important to remember that because a lot of people in the nonprofit world, they say to me is like, well, businesses have profit as their kind of true north, and therefore have like really clear accountability and a clear way to know if you're doing a good job or not. It's like, well, maybe for a mature company, but for a lot of startups, until we get to massive profitability, we are fundamentally a mission-driven organization operating on the faith of future profits, and therefore our metrics and analytics and everything has to be geared around impact, not profit, because we don't have any yet. And I think that's important for people in the nonprofit sector to realize. But also, just about once a year, I get asked to meet with a nonprofit foundation or a group of foundation funders to talk about what would it be like to do lean startup type investing in the foundation world. And this meeting has become so repetitive to me that I've come to saying the same thing every time. I say, listen, I will answer your question, but you're not going to do it. So that meeting is actually kind of a waste of time. And every time they're like, no, that's not going to happen. We totally are 100% committed. We're definitely going to do it. And then like I never hear from them again. And the reason is because I think there's like a very clear way that foundations could, if they wanted to, play a role kind of similar to what Chris is talking about in terms of the value add that a VC investor does, right? Like to be that accountability partner, but not have a controlling interest. And like, can you imagine a VC that was like, well, I don't want to pay for overhead. So like, I'll pay for your variable costs in making your product, but I don't want to pay for your fixed costs in developing it, sorry. And you'd be like, that is the world's worst VC. But a lot of foundations, that's the way they operate. And I think the reason they feel that way is it's hard to have accountability otherwise. So there's a simple answer to that, and it's say, as a foundation, have a certain allocation of your fund that you say, we are going to pay for outcomes. So we're not going to give you $1 million grant. We'll give you a grant of X dollars per person that you achieve this outcome with. And you scale the organization based on how fast you can take the money that we give you as a substitute for unit economics and profit. And then you are in control of how much money you get from us, right? The first year, we might give you a grant of $3. If that's all you earn. And then next year you might, so or like, I might give you a seed grant of $100,000. But say, look, after that, we'll pay you for outcomes only. And the nice thing about that is, first of all, forces you to become really clear and rigorous and agree with the startup. What are the outcomes that you're really willing to pay for, and not just like vague outcome reports that are like, oh, we had great impact, but no, like, these outcomes, we believe this metric enough to pay you for it. And it allows you to have a bit of that discipline where you can take the money you make from customers that we can, as for-profit companies, and reinvest it into growing the organization in a more organic way. So far, 0% of the funders I've told that story to have called me back. So if there's anyone in the audience, get in touch.
All right. On that note, we'll give a big round of applause to Eric and Chris. Thank you guys so much.
Chris, thank you for doing this.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it.